Hi everyone, welcome to another exciting comics loving comics advocacy edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, I am delighted to be talking with educator, advocate, person with an impressive shelfie, Matthew Noe. Matthew, thank you for joining today.
Thanks for having me. You got an impressive shelfie background there too.
Well, thank you, thank you. This one is just it's fake, so I can disappear into it. But we do have my wife and I are both teachers, so we have this many books plus a couple plus however many we've given away. So we just need more books in our lives. That's the thing.
Yeah, you can't see it, but I'm surrounded by piles of books on the floor because our
Yes.
two-bedroom apartment there's not room for any more bookcases, so they're just kind of piling up everywhere now.
Mm.
Uh,
What
what
a
are you gonna
beautiful
do?
problem to have. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, by means of an introduction, I jotted down a few notes about you. I know that you have a particular focus on graphic medicine. You work for Harvard Medical School Library, is that right?
That's right.
And I also know that you've been involved with the ALA, the American Librarian Association, for those that are not familiar with that, with the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable. So, any other accolades or sort of positions of what you've done that we should mention before we dive through some questions?
I mean, sure. Yeah, I'm a librarian. I also teach part-time as an adjunct at the University of Kentucky, in our School of Library Science. And then I'm a treasurer for my local public library board too. That's
Nice,
an
nice.
important part of that advocacy piece.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I mean, there's all kinds of stuff, but I'm not going to list like my whole CV for everybody. That's unnecessary.
I understand. I understand it. People can go check it out by all
Yeah.
means. So my first question, thinking about comics, thinking about the advocacy of librarians, is uh, sort of thinking about yourself as both a reader and a scholar. And I'm curious about the impact that comics have made on you.
Yeah, sure. So I always tell the origin story, right? I
Mhm.
actually didn't grow up reading comics so much. Like, I mean, I read like I'm 34. I grew up in the time of illegal digital scans of manga, so I read
Mm.
some of that. But there was not a comic book store in Bardstown, Kentucky. Like, there was just no real access point when I was a kid. Um, so I came to comics right around the same time I started grad school for library science, about 12 years ago now. And my now wife got me into reading comics. And it was like she was a reader. She got me started reading them. We were doing superheroes and all that. And then I'm thinking like library science, comics are cool. I'd started devouring everything.
Mhm.
Um, and I specialize in health sciences librarianship. So we were thinking about health literacy and patient education, and it kind of just seemed like an obvious next step. Um, Turns out lots of people in the past have thought that too. Not that it has ever had the momentum I think we have now in using comics in medical settings. It has existed in various pockets over time, which is part where my scholar piece is there. Like I published a scoping review of like studies attempting to look at using comics as a health education tool.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
up on the graphic medicine website for free if anyone wants to find it. But we see these different eras over time where comics were used as educational tools for health purposes, right? Like you've got all kinds of stuff pre Frederick Wertham's nonsense. Then it kind of dies away in the US. Then we see a lot of comics for health education in other countries. Like it was like we can educate quote unquote the third world using comics, even if we're not going to use them at home. Um, then the
Mhm.
underground comic
Mhm.
scene and HIV AIDS education pops up. There's a huge history of using comics as a prevention tool there and a public health tool. Um, and then it quiets down again. And then,
Yeah.
then in the mid 2000s, this thing we now call graphic medicine gets defined by Ian Williams over in the UK. And that defining of it seems to have really mattered for pulling people together. So now we have this like burgeoning field and all kinds of people studying the uses of comics in both medical education and patient education and public health and everything else. And it's just growing and growing and growing. so as a scholar, like I came in at a good time.
Hmm.
Um, I started building everywhere I've worked now. I have built a collection of comics in a medical setting, which is not something that was there before. So I've been able to do a lot of pioneer kind of stuff and bring in new exciting opportunities. So yeah, and I mean, as a reader, like I am primarily not a visual person. I tend to focus a lot more on the text of things.
Hmm.
Um, but so for me, I think of comics as a great like almost a challenge sometimes because I get to flex a different part of my reading brain.
Yeah,
Every
yeah,
year I basically read about half comics and half books, and I try to split it up a bit. See, and I like to read widely, and comics let me do that too, right?
yeah, yeah. So I'm curious about the work you've done in comics advocacy and a little bit of how that has come to be.
Yeah, of course. So there's an element of if you're talking about using comics in a medical school, you kind of are going to end up by default having to do some advocacy work for comics because you're in an environment where people are going to scoff at you. And
Mm-hmm.
comics are, funny pages or they're all just superheroes, and as if there's something wrong with funny pages or superheroes. I take offense to that in itself too, but they're like very dismissive of this idea. So I spend a lot of time educating faculty and other staff about the potential use of comics in serious topics and in education settings, right? Um, I, you know, I, there are some things that have helped a lot. Like Linda Berry is a great, a great resource and person to point to for this.
Hmm.
If someone, doing cartooning work can win a MacArthur Genius Grant, it usually helps light people's brains up and be like, oh, this is a real thing. Because we live in this,
Yes,
this world of, academic rigor and hoity-toityness, right?
yes, yes.
But so there's that level of advocacy. And then, you mentioned that so I'm a past president for the American Library Association's Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable. I came into that position. I think I was officially president in 2021, 2022, but they're like 3-year terms. So you have
Mm.
a, an elect term and then a past term. So I just rolled off of that really. Um, but so I came into that right at a time when all of a sudden we're seeing, Frederick Wortham slash McCarthy slash satanic panic scare version, whatever number we're on. Um,
Yes.
and so suddenly I'm just like, okay, comics and libraries are great. We've reached a point where a lot of teachers are listening to us, and comics are more accepted in the classroom. They're more accepted in the school library. And then all of a sudden, bam, hammer down. Uh, mask mandates protest morphed into, trans panic debates, and comic books are corrupting the youth again. And
Hmm. Hmm.
so we've had to do a lot of pivoting, and unfortunately we found ourselves in a position of reacting. We've done a lot more proactive stuff now. We're getting there, but we're like all of a sudden on the fence. I mean, ALA has been celebrating, so I don't like the idea of celebrating Banned Books Week, but we've been celebrating Banned Books Week for decades. So it's not like we weren't prepared at all, but it used to be someone shows up and is upset about a book, one person challenges it, you have a conversation, and then it's over.
Hmm. Hmm.
Occasionally you'd get flare-ups, like Persepolis got flared up a decade ago.
Yeah.
But then it's over. Now we've got, you know, the last number was like 4,000 challenges or something last year. And the vast majority of them are books featuring, queer characters or written by queer people or otherwise or about Black history, Indigenous history, all these things that, might question some norms in the US that some people don't want questioned.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and comics are unfortunately pretty easy to attack because you can take an image out of context, circulate it on social media 8 million times, and suddenly everyone thinks genderqueer is A, for children, and B, porn. It is neither of those things.
Hmm.
Um, and so the advocacy part comes in, like, I During my term, I created a task force in response called uh, addressing challenges and bans of comics in like libraries group. So the goal is to help librarians and library workers better prepare themselves for these challenges. So doing things like making sure your collection development policy is in good shape, having a good challenges policy, um, making sure you're actually spending time advocating for comics in your own space, like
Mhm.
educating your community is a key thing, right? And then, making sure you're taking care of yourself and having allies in the community. A lot of this like advocacy work around comics is the same thing you'll see in other advocacy stuff. It's about building community, finding allies, um, mobilizing people when the time comes. Like you can't wait until a challenge shows up to be like, oh, I need friends. You have to have friends ready
Mhm.
to help you from the get-go. So we're doing a lot of education about community organizing, I think. And we haven't had to do as much of that in libraries in recent memory, so it's a learning curve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is a lot of activity there, absolutely. And lots of conversations about book access to be had in a lot of different places at a lot of different levels.
Right. And so that's, yeah, I spent a lot of rambling there about the specific challenges piece, but there's also like advocating for, you know, publishers to make digital access to comics more possible.
Hmm.
Uh, I primarily I spent a lot of time arguing for the importance of physical collections in 2024, the value of, serendipitous browsing, and then actually owning the material as a library, instead of just licensing it for X number of checkouts or X number of years,
Hmm.
or in an academic setting, not even being able to get access to it at all. A lot of comics are digitally only available on platforms like, I'm not going to name them because I don't want you to get in trouble or me to get in trouble. They're only really available on those platforms that are public library focused and really have a Netflix style business model,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Hmm.
You pay every year or your access disappears as if it never existed. Um, and that's just not sustainable for libraries. And comics are particularly hard to find ebooks for in a library setting, probably in a personal reader setting too. But in libraries, it's pretty rough. And so trying to work with vendors and publishers and explain what we need and why it's a good idea to sell to us and all of that behind the scenes kind of negotiating that doesn't really get shared publicly as often. Yeah, that's happening too.
Yeah, yeah. Sounds like you are a very busy person in your role, or multiple roles, as it were.
Right, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned some of those conversations with faculty members and sort of educating about the possibilities of what comics can do. Any sort of major theme that you would share on that from those conversations?
Yeah, so there's a part in the introduction of the Graphic Medicine Manifesto, which is like the foundational academic scholarly work on the field. Um, it was purposely named the Manifesto because they were trying to disrupt some norms here.
Hmm.
And so there's a talking point in there about how comics can show multiple competing perspectives at the same time, and those competing perspectives may all be valid. Um, and that's really powerful, I think, in a health setting where there's a huge power imbalance.
Hmm.
Um, you show up to a hospital, you're suddenly part of this large system, often for profit, often where you don't really have any, leverage to to bring to the fore. And you may not, you often are scared and don't know what's going on. So you're relying on the physician to know what's happening, and they may have one perspective of what's going on, whereas your own lived experience might not match up what they're saying is happening. Um, Pain. So for myself, I have a chronic pain condition. This is a common issue for people with pain. Pain is subjective. Like it's an objective reality that your body is experiencing these chemical signals, neuro, whatever, blah, 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 but your own experience of how that pain is subjective.
Hmm.
And having in like So you, as a patient with a long-term chronic condition, whatever it may be, are probably the expert on your own experience, right? The doctor, in theory, is the expert on the medical side of this. Not always, but in theory, that's the hope is that they're trained.
Mhm.
And so you could have a clash here because medical science might not always have a good way to explain what you're experiencing
Mhm.
because it's an
Mhm.
evolving process, right? And so being able to put those things, those two competing valid experiences together, comics offers a unique opportunity there because you can play with the panel and the sense of time, and you can split the pages and have both people talking over each other and past each other in a way that like it's hard to do that in prose. You can, but it's not that it's harder to do and less effective, I think. And in film, you can see that sometimes. Like you can go watch old episodes of House for bad examples of this talking past each other. Um, but like there's that's not you're not really going to get a memoir in a TV show. Most people are not
Mhm.
going to sit down and watch a documentary either. And there's affordances in comics like the guttering and the playing with time that are really powerful for getting these things across. So yeah, I think that that's an important thing. And I mentioned Linda Berry, this
Mhm.
idea of drawing as its own form of thinking, right? Um, a soapbox I will not get us on right now is I'm very concerned about uh, AI. I have
Mhm.
large moral quandaries about it and concerns, but also I keep seeing people suggest that it's great as a first pass brainstorming tool.
Right.
But that means that you're offloading the most creative part of your writing and thinking processes to AI.
Mhm.
Like me personally, if we have to use it, I'd rather see it used for things like grammar checking, like Grammarly,
Mhm.
because
Mhm.
then it's not necessarily conducting the thought process for you. It's fixing like technical things.
Yeah. Yeah, that
Using it
makes
to
sense.
brainstorm is giving up your creative control. So yeah, that's so drawing is thinking is a big part of this too, and encouraging med students to uh they often have to do reflective essays as they come out of rotations.
Mhm.
um so I try to advocate for letting them draw those instead of just type them up. Let them explore color theory and different ways of those competing perspectives. I've had some really amazing reflections come out of drawing with stuff like that, and students tell me that I had not considered what that experience meant until I tried to draw it, and then suddenly it was a revelatory thing.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. And I hadn't thought about the sort of the brainstorming that way with AI, but you're absolutely right. And that way everything just gets to be the same. It's whatever
Mhm.
sort of template AI gives us. So absolutely spot on commentary there. Uh, you mentioned Linda Berry there, and so I want to give the space for any other resources that you might want to share with listeners as well.
Yeah, of course. I mean, since it's there, I'll throw out syllabus is like I have built programming off of that book for years. I highly recommend it. Um, I'm also like, if you want to check out more of what the Graphic Novels and Comics Roundtable is up to, ALA just yesterday on May 1st launched, that wasn't yesterday, on May 1st launched their new website. So the URL is a little different, I think, but it's so like ala.org/GNCRT, I think will get you there.
Hmm.
So for library folks, there's all kinds of like helpful tips and tricks there. If you're big on using comics for health purposes, graphicmedicine.org is basically the hub for all of this. I'm one of the web team for that website, so if you have questions, contact me later. Um, and I always have to give book shout outs. Can I do book shout
Yes,
outs? Yeah.
please do. Please do.
So semi self-serving one because I wrote the foreword to this,
Yes.
Ripple
Uh-huh.
Effects.
Hmm.
Eisner nominated, won all kinds of cool awards. It's a superhero tale about chronic illness. Um, so it's in that field of graphic medicine, but the part about this I love the most is the inclusion of, after every individual issue, there's an essay by someone living with a chronic illness that
Mm-hmm.
reflects upon the prior issue's content while also talking about their own condition and what it's like to live in the world like this. So it's a great educational tool, great example of using comics to explore those competing perspectives, and doing it with superheroes, because superheroes can be great too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um,
Absolutely.
I'll only do one. My other shout out is for Here I Am Me, uh,
Yes. Uh-huh.
an illustrated guide to mental health by Cara Bean. I'm doing a fun like brewery event with her and some other folks next week. But this is a great example of like using comics as an educational tool. It's
Mm-hmm.
almost structured like a textbook, where each chapter is talking about a different aspect of mental health and, your brain's biology and everything, and some of the conditions that come along with that. But the visual metaphors are so great here, including there's a few, like, everyone experiences anxiety and depression a little differently, right? So
Mm-hmm.
rather than providing one or two examples of how we describe that, there are these spreads where there's like 24 individual box panels with different metaphors that people use to describe anxiety or depression, all visualized out, which I think is a really great chance for people to think about new ways to express what they're feeling and to consider their own metaphors valid. So yeah, those are
Absolutely.
some reading recommendations for you. I can give a million like teaching recommendations, but I'll leave it there and let people be like, "Hey, Matthew, tell me what you want me to read next if they want."
Love it, love it. Always up for book recommendations. Always glad to talk with a fellow comics advocate. Always glad to talk with someone who enjoys the work of Terry Pratchett as well.
I see you noticed that back there.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes,
yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. And glad to be in touch with you, Matthew. Thanks for the
yeah.
conversation. Anything that we missed that you want to make sure to share before we close out?
I don't think so, unless someone wants to travel to Ireland and join us for graphic medicine in Athlone in July.
Hey,
It'll be really great. So,
that's on my destination list. So sounds wonderful.
yeah.
All
Thanks
right.
for having me.
A pleasure, a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming and hope you have a good rest of the day.
Yeah, you as well.
All right. Thank you.